Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Palestine in Session, titled A Textbook Case of Genocide, Israeli Accountability, and U.S. Complicity. I'm honored to have a distinguished and young panel of intellectuals, lawyers, educators, and activists, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But before we begin, I want to set the backdrop for this discussion that I believe will provide something that has been sorely missing from our mainstream press and political leadership, and that is context. Gaza is a narrow strip of land, about 25 miles long, 6 to 7 miles wide, and for the past 75 plus years, Gaza has endured various forms of control and oppression, and of the 750,000 Palestinians who were dispossessed and ethnically cleansed from their homes and homeland by Zionist militia and army, approximately 200,000 of them, that's more than one-fourth, were driven into Gaza. This was the height of what Palestinians call a Nakba, or catastrophe. And for 75 years, Palestinians in Gaza have been deprived of their internationally enshrined right to return and denied self-determination. From 1948 to 1955, Israel imposed a shoot-to-kill policy to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes and homeland, and committed acts of mass murder and destruction in Gaza. And from November 1956 to March 1957, Israeli forces killed 1,000 Palestinians during its occupation of Gaza. And until 1967, Israel maintained a policy of closure and denial of basic rights. From 1967 to 1987, settlements expanded and Israel deepened its occupation of Gaza, from bulldozing refugee camps, burying alive an unknown number of Palestinians, to intensifying its policy of control, containment, immobility, and surveillance. And as a result of the First Intifada, from 1987 to 1993, Israel entrenched its occupation and apartheid rule in Gaza and implemented, through its so-called dovish leader, Yitzhak Rabin, a bone-crushing policy as punishment for having the audacity to express opposition and rejection to Israeli occupation, colonization, and oppression. And in 1991, Israel revoked the general exit permit issued in 1972, requiring Palestinians to request individual exit permits every time they wanted to leave. And from 1993 to 1996, for the first time, Israel completed 60 kilometers of barbed wire, sensor-laden fencing around Gaza, completely sealing off Gaza from the rest of the world. And let's remember, this was during the heyday of the so-called peace process. And after the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2003, where 3,000 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, in 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza and pulled its troops and illegal settlers from Gaza, but maintained the occupation by means of effective control, basically changing the style and form of the occupation from occupation by boots to occupation by remote. Israel still controlled Gaza by air, by land, by sea, still controlled the population registry, the electromagnetic sphere, and what comes in, what comes out, who comes in, who comes out. And in 2007, Israel declared Gaza hostile territory and imposed a brutal military siege and blockade. And from 2008 to the present, Israel bombarded Gaza approximately 7 times outside the daily effects of the blockade and siege, claiming thousands of lives. Now, there's much more to say, and I've spoken long enough, but I believe we needed some context for this discussion today regarding genocide in Gaza. And now to our esteemed panel, and I will introduce them, and then we'll get right to it. We're thankful to have Ahmed Abu Fawd, who's an international lawyer, legal researcher, advocacy officer at Al-Haq organization, and a research fellow on legal mobilization at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Born and raised in Gaza, based in The Hague, he holds a master's degree in public international law, specializing in international criminal law from Leiden University, and holds a bachelor's of law from Al-Azhar University in Gaza. Asta Sharma Pokharal is a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she specializes in international human rights and in challenging racial and environmental injustice, abusive immigration practices, and incarceration. At the Center for Constitutional Rights, she has worked to defend the constitutional rights of advocates for justice in Palestine and advocates for environmental justice, including in cases such as Bronner v. Duggan, defending an individual who was sued for the American Studies Association's decision to endorse the call for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. And lastly, we have with us Tahir Harzallah. He's the Director of Outreach and Grassroots Organizing at AMP. In his capacity, Harzallah acts as a liaison between campus activism groups on campuses across the country. He helps these groups procure grants, materials, and speakers. He's also instrumental in helping students set up programs and activities, and coordinates AMP's grassroots organizing and helps facilitate national coalition building. I must say that I did butcher all of these bios, or knock them down in half at least, because there's a lot that we need to get to. And Ahmed, I know you're in The Hague and I know it's late, so I want you to go first. And I want to present you with this overarching question, and I want you to take this discussion in the present context. So the Republic of South Africa submitted its application to the International Court of Justice against Israel, alleging violations of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. Can you please speak to the significance of this move by South Africa, what you believe will come of this, and more fundamentally, lay out the crime of genocide for our audience? Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for this important discussion. Genocide is a crime under international law, and it's clearly defined by the Genocide Convention and also by the Rome Statute. This crime is committed when it's directed against a national or racial group with the intention to destroy that group in whole or in part, and it requires a special intent to destroy that group. There are several underlying acts that underline the commission of this crime, including killing of members of that group, creating conditions calculated to bring the destruction of that group, among other underlying acts. The importance of this step that it is now for a court to decide on provision measures, and this particular proceedings, the court does not need to decide on the merits of the case, so it's not required from the court to decide if genocide is being committed or not, but it's enough for the court to find that it's plausible that there is a risk of genocide, and therefore it can order these provisional measures, including the cessation of hostilities, allowing humanitarian aid, and allowing preservation of evidence, including commission of inquiries and investigative bodies to enter the Gaza Strip. The importance also of this case, I think, that for the first time, Israel is accused of genocide before a court of law. It's not merely an accusation, and the strong case provided by South Africa, I think, made it clear that there is serious risk of genocide. In my view, it won't be difficult for the court to decide that on the provisional measures. The question is which provisional measures the court will decide on. Many of the things requested by South Africa, as I mentioned, they're not really controversial or hard to rule on in such situation, including the allowance of humanitarian aid and preservation of evidence. The question is whether the court will rule on, will order cessation of hostilities or not, but that's for the court to decide. On the case that South Africa presented, I think South Africa presented a very strong, well-argued case, and showed clearly that there is serious risk of genocide. Usually, Tariq, in such cases, the hardest part to prove is the special intent, so is the intention to commit genocide. In this case, there is numerous statements clearly showing the intention to commit genocide, and from Israeli politicians and leaders at the highest level. And personally, I think the reason to that is the prevailing impunity that Israel has been enjoying for decades, and that Israel's allies have been providing diplomatic coverage for Israel to enjoy that impunity. They simply don't care. They simply think they're untouchable. And in my view, this is has been an Israeli policy for decades to ensure this impunity, because the whole Zionist regime, or the Zionist ideology, the Israeli apartheid regime, is premised on a promise of impunity to its soldiers in order to oppress the Palestinians. So they know the moment that there is any person held accountable, uh, or if it's decided that the state is committing this crime, the whole system will be shaken. So now we're talking about the International Court of Justice, and this is interstate litigation. So states go to court to solve dispute, but we must not forget that there is also an active investigation at the International Criminal Court where certain individuals can be held accountable for their individual criminal responsibility. Um, and I think that's also another important mechanism that Palestinians are looking to and waiting for arrest warrants to be issued. Um, on the move itself, on the fact that it was South Africa that started this case, I think it carries the moral and ethical weight that is coming from South Africa. It's coming from a state that has experienced the horrific brutality of racism, of apartheid. It has experienced settler colonialism and its genocidal attitude towards the indigenous population. So the South Africans understand it very, very, very much because they've experienced it. But I think it also represents something that is much bigger than that, in my view, and that is that the global South is fed up with Western hypocrisy, selectivity, and double standards, and taking things in their hands. And therefore, I think what South Africa is doing is not only speaking principally about international law and standing for the Palestinian people and the danger, the existential danger that they are facing, but they're also, I think, standing up for humanity and saving whatever is left of it, and for international law, saving the credibility of international law again, or what's left of it. So I think the International Court of Justice um, will be dealing with a case that is very important, not only for the Palestinian people, but for the very body of international law and its credibility. And this case will show us if this body of law is actually international as it entails and is for everyone, or only for certain people, because the attitude of European states in the West has been showing us that they only deal with this body of law as their property, as something they can use against their foes, but not against themselves. But if you allow me, I'll conclude with that. I think it's also um, it's showing us as a human being that it doesn't matter how much you're connected to another nation. The struggle against colonialism, racism, is a shared one, and regardless of the differences of our colors and our backgrounds, we share this experience when we are under the oppression of such racist regimes. And what I'm trying to say here, that South Africa is showing true leadership to the world. The world must look and learn, but it's also putting our Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters to shame. These states that have been watching the slaughter of the Palestinian people and not taking any action, the bare minimum they could do is take the legal path, is take Israel to court. And unfortunately, we haven't seen this from any other state. But luckily for I think we're lucky to have such leadership from South Africa, but also from other states. If you allow me, one other thing I like to say is, since the court started the procedure, we started seeing reactions from all of these states that have been portraying themselves as beacons of democracy and human rights and supporting international law. Some of them had a hostile attitude toward the ICJ simply because it's looking at a case that is not within their interest. So you have, for example, Germany announcing that it will intervene in favor of Israel, and the response came from Namibia, Namibia presidency issued a statement basically telling Germany, you are of no place to intervene. You committed the first genocide in the 20th century against the Namibian people and still didn't make up for it. It still didn't recognize it and apologize for it and compensated those who suffered. So I think you see such reaction. It shows you that our part of the world is fed up with our colleagues in the West and their hypocrisy and selectivity. And I think this is an important point of history where global South is taking things in their hand and telling the whole world, if we were to move forward as a human race, we need to abide by one law. We need to have the same law because we no longer live in a world where there is masters and slaves. We're equal and we would like to be treated as such. I'll stop there and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, for setting the stage for us. And we'll definitely piggyback off of what you said. And I just want to add one brief comment before we go to Esther, and that is that, regardless of whether the court imposes 9 or one of these or none of these provisional measures, the fact that Israel is on trial is a big step forward. And obviously we definitely hope for the most that we can get, but this is one step that we have to use in our path towards justice for the Palestinians. So thank you for that. And Esther, I want to talk to you because here in the United States, there's a lawsuit. On November 13th, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a federal suit on behalf of Palestinian human rights organizations and Palestinians in Gaza and U.S. citizens against President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So these are the 3 defendants for their failure to prevent genocide and complicity in the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Can you give us a little insight into this lawsuit and how we can utilize this moment to further its purpose?
Thank you so much, Tariq, and thank you, Ahmed, for really setting the stage for us and identifying this moment that we're in, setting it against the context of the history that has culminated in this genocide. So that's right. Like you said, Tariq, in November, the Center for Constitutional Rights, alongside our co-counsel at Vanderhout, a law firm here in San Francisco, filed a lawsuit against Defendant Biden, Defendant Austin, and Defendant Blinken. And the lawsuit consists of 2 claims. The first is that these defendants are liable for their failure to prevent genocide, which I'll talk about in a moment. And second, that they are liable for being complicit or actually supporting or aiding and abetting the genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza. And the lawsuit, like you said, is on behalf of 2 Palestinian organizations, Defense for Children International Palestine and Al-Haq, which Ahmed is part of. So it is also on behalf of 3 Palestinians in Gaza and 5 Palestinian Americans with families in Gaza. And this is why it's filed in federal district court, because it is against U.S. defendants filed by Palestinian Americans, several of whom are based here in the Bay Area where I am. There's actually a hearing that's going to be on January 26th, a hearing on this lawsuit, both in person in Oakland, if any of your listeners are in Oakland, and also it can be watched remotely or virtually. So if you want to tune into that. And liability in this lawsuit, we argue, arises under customary international law, which U.S. courts have recognized is a part of U.S. federal common law. And like Ahmed described, international law prohibits genocide, and this prohibition is codified in the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute, and also in U.S. federal criminal law in the Genocide Implementation Act, which Biden, who was then a senator at the time, actually co-sponsored in 1988. So like Ahmed described, the definition of genocide includes 2 elements. The first are the underlying acts of genocide. And in our lawsuit, we identify and describe 3 of these underlying acts. One is killing members of a particular group. The second is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group. And the third is deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about that group's destruction. And so, as you can see from the definition of genocide, mass killing or direct killing by itself is not required. Although, of course, in this case, we have mass killing. Over 25,000 people have been killed by Israel since October 7th. But an important component of the genocide that's ongoing in Gaza is the total siege that Israel has imposed on Gaza, which it announced on October 9th. The total siege on food, on water, on electricity, on fuel, and its attacks on the healthcare sector, a healthcare sector which at this point has essentially collapsed. Its attack on cultural and educational institutions, its attacks on refugee camps, on schools. So these are acts that constitute genocide because they are intended to inflict conditions of life that are calculated to bring about this group's destruction. And then the second element of genocide is, as Ahmed was describing, this element of specific intent. And genocide needs to be committed. If it is to be proven as a genocide, these underlying acts need to be committed with the specific intent to commit genocide. And a lot of this can be gleaned from the statements by Israeli officials at the highest levels of government describing their genocidal intent. And I think especially as we're now over 3 months into this genocide, the scope and the scale of these attacks also reveal this genocidal intent. You don't destroy an entire healthcare sector. You don't destroy an entire every university in Gaza. You don't attack refugee camps and schools and churches and say that there is any other intent other than to destroy the people of the Palestinian people of Gaza. So, of course, this lawsuit that we've brought in the U.S., though, is not against Israel. It's against the U.S. These U.S. defendants, and the two claims, like I said, are their failure and their obligation to prevent genocide and complicity in genocide. The prohibition on genocide imposes a duty on the U.S. and U.S. actors who have influence over Israel. Once they learn of a substantial risk of genocide, there does not even have to be a genocide occurring, but there needs to only be a risk of genocide. Once they learn of that risk, they are required under law to use all measures within their power to stop the genocide. And in our lawsuit, we've included a declaration in our filing by one of the leading scholar on genocide, William Shabbas, Professor Shabbas, who lays out this framework of the duty to prevent genocide and really focuses on the U.S.'s failure to uphold this obligation. And in a moment, I can share in the chat a link to all of our filings. So the duty to prevent, or this failure to prevent, is one of the claims. The second claim is complicity in genocide, or aiding and abetting genocide. From the moment that this genocide has been occurring and unfolding in Gaza, the United States has supported Israel unequivocally. It has sent weapons unconditionally to Israel. It has sent equipment. It has sent advisors. And so these are all acts of aiding and abetting Israel's genocide in Gaza. The relief that we're seeking in this lawsuit is an end to all U.S. support of Israel and its genocidal campaign in Gaza, and this would include, military support and weapons that the United States is again rapidly sending to Gaza. To Israel for its attack on Gaza. And since our filing, things in Gaza have, of course, only gotten worse. But since our original filing, the defendants in this case have had an opportunity to respond to our filing, and they haven't as yet, and they likely won't engage with the merits of this question, of whether there actually is a genocide and whether the United States is complicit in it, whether it's failed to prevent it. A lot of the arguments that they've raised have been sort of on what are called jurisdictional issues. So the question of whether the court can even get to the stage of answering these substantive questions. And I just want to uplift two of the arguments that the defendants have raised that we might discuss at the hearing on the 26th. The first is this idea, this argument that they've raised that that these are questions. This is a lawsuit about foreign affairs, about foreign policy, that should be left up to the discretion of these defendants, of Biden and his administration. But the question of genocide, the question of whether there is a genocide unfolding, ongoing in Gaza, whether these defendants have failed in their duty to prevent genocide, whether they are aiding and abetting genocide, these are legal questions with legal standards. The prohibition is a legal mandate. These are not discretionary choices. Biden does not have the discretion to commit genocide. He is prohibited from committing it, or from aiding and abetting it, or from failing to prevent it. And so these are not discretionary policy questions. These are clear legal mandates with clear legal standards that a court has the power and the responsibility to assess. The second argument that I think might be interesting for you all to think about, and maybe we'll get into in the hearing, they've argued that these plaintiffs can't bring these claims against these defendants because what these plaintiffs are complaining about are Israel's independent actions. And I think this argument is it's one approach that the U.S. has taken in its legal filings. These defendants have taken in their legal filings, but it's pretty inconsistent with what we've heard from the U.S. government since October 7th, which is their statements really boasting about how much they've coordinated with Israel and how much they've supported Israel since October 7th for its assault on Gaza. And it's also inconsistent with, as many of you all probably know, the immense support that the United States has provided historically to Israel for its military budget. And it's inconsistent with how much the United States has sent to Israel since October 7th in the form of military equipment and weapons. It's inconsistent with the reporting that many of you might have seen about the number of US-sourced bombs that have been used in Gaza since October 7th. There was a report from several weeks ago that 22,000 US-sourced bombs had been dropped in Gaza since October 7th. So these are arguments that they've put forward, and I think really illuminate their position, but their position as their legal position, but their legal position is inconsistent with what they've done politically. There are also some amicus briefs that were filed in our lawsuit. So friends of the court briefs, one by Palestinian Americans who describe the impact that they have felt, the impact to their families in Gaza, and how it has felt to be a Palestinian American in the US while this genocide has been unfolding. There's an amicus brief from Jewish Voice for Peace who describes the importance of preventing genocide and how never again means never again for everybody. There's a amicus brief from Palestinian journalists who describe how journalists have been targeted in Gaza by the Israeli military. There's a amicus brief by medical professionals who describe the targeting of the healthcare sector in Gaza. And finally, there's an amicus brief by over 70 international human rights organizations describing the importance of the prohibition on genocide. And I really appreciate Ahmed for laying out the sort of context of the ICJ's case, of South Africa's case in front of the International Court of Justice against Israel. I think it was a historic document that South Africa filed. It's a historic moment that South Africa has brought this case, a country that itself has survived a history of colonialism and apartheid, and that it has raised the claim of genocide and put the genocide in the context of a history of occupation and apartheid. So I think it's really powerful and historic, and the fact that these two countries, that Israel and the United States, have at least two lawsuits, one at the World Court and one in U.S. Federal District Court against them, raising the claim of genocide. These two countries that hold themselves out to be moral leaders and moral authorities in the international community. I think even just the fact of these lawsuits reveal that they're not moral authorities, leaders in the international community. They're instead international pariahs. They're isolated, and they're especially isolated by people and states that reflect the global South. So I'll pause there.
Well, thank you for that. And I do recommend, for those that do want to learn more about these, the South African application and also the lawsuit that the Center for Constitutional Rights has filed, do read them. They're pretty dense, but it's very important information, and it really lays out what is actually taking place on the ground, and also how the legal argument is framed. Tahir, you're my colleague. It's an honor to have you here. I know that you have family in Gaza. I know that you've suffered some losses as well. I want you to speak to that, but also speak about the work that you're doing and how you're able to mobilize in these last 100+ days, and where you see this going from here, and your own personal experience.
Thank you, Tariq, for bringing me on, and I'm honored to be with Ahmed and Asta, two incredible attorneys working on the most important legal cases in my opinion, in the history of Palestine in this moment. Well, as you can imagine, the situation in Gaza for a lot of the families, every family, really, not a lot, every family has been touched by this genocide. Is extremely difficult, and I just want to kind of give the audience a glimpse of what things are like in Gaza from a very personal standpoint. My family lives in Gaza City, or I should say lived in Gaza City, in various neighborhoods, and the Gaza City is obviously in the northern part of Gaza that has been attacked since the beginning of the war, and has been ravaged really by intense aerial bombardment, and compounded with the cutting off of electricity, water, food. It's really been just an area of death, pure death in this region. And so when I'm communicating with the family members in Gaza City about what it's like, they're telling me the raw information that they could provide, and that is that they're living minute by minute, and the ability to leave the home is limited. They are stuck in their home. They cannot put their head out the window, or else they'd risk being hit by the snipers that are all over the neighborhood. The tanks rumble in and out of the neighborhood, and that was back at the end of November. In December, I got news that my family members' homes were raided by Israeli forces. The men were taken captive. The women and the children were displaced and forced to leave the home. And the men were detained for at least 24 hours without any cause or reason. They were stripped, put in an area where they detained them, and then they forced them to watch as the Israelis attached mines and TNT to their building and destroyed the entire 4-story building that housed my relatives. And so the pain of the suffering is immense. It's something that I cannot fully describe because I haven't felt it myself and been in that experience, but living vicariously through them as my family members, and hearing the stories, I can just illustrate to you and demonstrate just how and crazy and just genocidal this rampage has been. Now, you might think, alhamdulillah, thankfully they made it. They didn't die, in this situation. Their lives were spared. However, you have to understand that, in Gaza, where conditions were already very difficult prior to October 7th, having a home, having any type of wealth, having cars and vehicles, all that stuff was a luxury. And now everything that they had worked towards building for decades as a family was completely taken from them. My dad's relative told me that the money that they had in the home was taken by the Israeli forces. Um, Anything of importance was basically looted by the Israeli forces, and then they blew up the house with the cars and everything in it, in the downstairs garage area. And so now their whole life is at a standstill. You have a situation now where they lost the documents. I mean, everything that represents the family's presence, from legal documents, from official birth certificates, etc., their IDs, their passports, everything, it's gone. I mean, it's completely gone. And so there is this deliberate process of erasure that is taking place that maybe some people are just watching or observing from afar might not recognize that, like, the difficulty of rebuilding is it's I mean it's unimaginable at this point, considering the level of devastation that we're witnessing in Gaza. And this is just one example of many that we're hearing of cases in Gaza where people are telling us, what is taking place, relatives, friends of relatives, and frankly, it's devastating. And so what we've been trying to do, frankly, is there a lot of families have been reaching out to us, uh, Palestinian American families who have relatives in Gaza, my relatives as well, reaching out asking, is it possible to get us out in this situation with the lack of basic things such as food and water. Living on a day-to-day basis is just impossible. My dad's older relatives, his aunt, for example, um, is diabetic. She needs insulin. There's no insulin in Gaza. There's a serious shortage of that, and so you can imagine somebody with type 2 diabetes who's required to have insulin daily now is living in a situation where they have no medication and there's no food, so they're forced to eat whatever is available, and that might not be good for their health. And so you're talking about a slow and painful death that a lot of people are experiencing in Gaza. um and it's so devastating to even talk about, but to know that it's happening and that there's nothing I can do to prevent it is even more devastating. And so we've been in communication with the State Department about this. I have personally, I know the organization has also done some advocacy in that regard of talking about, at least saving the lives of the people that we can in this situation. I've mentioned this to other people, but I've never felt more than before, but now more than before, how real it is that my family's presence in Gaza is coming to an end. I mean, it's either through murder or displacement or injury. Um, I mean, maybe Mr. Abu Hod knows about Dar Harzallah. We're a very well known family in Gaza City. People know who we are, but I feel like the sheer level of devastation and attack that's deliberately targeting our homes, our businesses, is so bad that the presence of the family in Gaza is under threat. And so we're trying to work to save people. The problem is the United States government has very clear um, eligibility requirements for evacuating people from Gaza. Obviously, if you're an American citizen, you're able to evacuate from Gaza. The Americans will send your name to be put on the list at the Rafah border crossing, and then you will be able to exit and leave Gaza. However, there are eligibility requirements for immediate family members of U.S. citizens, and that includes, for example, your spouse, unmarried children under the age of 21, parents of U.S. citizens, and siblings who are unmarried and under 21. So those are people that, if you're a U.S. citizen and you want to uh, uh, help, evacuate some of your family members those are the people that you can evacuate. If you are a legal permanent resident or otherwise a green card holder, you're only allowed to evacuate your spouse or unmarried children under 21 years of age. And I have so many cases now of people contacting me who are legal permanent residents in the United States, or here on a student visa, and they want to evacuate their parents or they want to evacuate their siblings, and they cannot because they don't meet the eligibility requirements that the U.S. government has set in place. And so people are reaching out to the if at first the State Department had a crisis intake form where people are filling it out for their relatives to hopefully get them to be on the list, but then they took down that crisis intake form because it was overwhelmed with how many people were responding to or filling out those forms. And so now you have to email the um the embassy in Jerusalem, and with the names and ID numbers of the family members or relatives that you want to evacuate, and then hopefully maybe they will or will not accept them, or then through the process of negotiating with the Israeli Kogat team, whether or not their names will be allowed to be on the Rafah border crossing. And so there's a whole dimension here that a lot of people also don't understand, is that the State Department will constantly tell us that it's not up to us. This is something that the Israelis and the Egyptians decide as to who goes in and who goes out of Gaza. And it's causing a tremendous amount of heartache and devastation on family members who in the US who are trying to evacuate their own relatives. And it's even worse when you have someone waiting in Rafah in Gaza who's ready to leave, but they can't because the Israeli Kogat security operation and coordination with the Egyptians will not allow them to leave, even though people are willing and able to welcome them once they leave Gaza. And so this is what we're dealing with right now on a day-to-day basis. Just trying to work with whatever we can to save as many lives as possible.
Well, go ahead. I don't know what to say, man. I wish you and your family safety. Inshallah. No one else is harmed, but inshallah, I just wish you the best. Sometimes I get speechless when I hear those stories. I heard plenty of them. I did want to piggyback, and thank you, Ahmed, for staying. I know it's late where you're at, but there is a phrase that is said, and it was said during South Africa's argument as well, and was also said in the application. And the main legal phrase is that genocide is a peremptory norm. Use cogens norms creating obligations erga omnes. That's just the Latin fancy phrase of saying that it's such a severe crime that there is no defense to it. If you can just speak a little bit more about that, and also because you did mention the other very important court, the ICC. If you can just talk about just the basic fundamental distinction between the ICJ, or what is known as the World Court, and the ICC.
Yes, thank you, and I'm sorry to hear about your family, Tahir. My family is also still in Gaza, and I know the struggle. And yes, I know the family very well. Hadzallah family is a well-known family in Gaza. They were friends, classmates, and if you allow me, Tarek, before answering your question, I concur with what Tahir said. It is true. Gaza that we know is basically no longer exists. And I think people still don't understand the level of destruction that has been done to Gaza. I haven't. I usually refuse to speak about what I think or what we went through, because there seemed to be a tendency, especially in the West, that they want you to be as a victim and only as a good victim. Not the type of victim that would bring context to the situation. But in brief, just from a personal perspective, everything I ever knew in Gaza is destroyed. I'm also from Gaza City, so from the north. So my kindergarten has been destroyed. My elementary school has been destroyed. My secondary school, my university has been blown out. So every place I know or I went to, including family homes, have been destroyed. So yeah, nothing of Gaza is left, especially the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and especially Gaza City. and this is not accidental or collateral damages of the war. No, this was a policy. This was an intended policy. It was for no military objective or for no legitimate targets in these buildings. We've seen videos of the Israelis blowing up universities, buildings, and the reason to that it is clear and actually shamelessly announced by the Israeli leadership is to make Gaza uninhabitable in order to creating conditions to induce people to leave the Gaza Strip. And this is not new. This is a long announced Zionist dream to ethnically cleanse Gaza. You mentioned Rabin and his broken bones policy, but Rabin was also the one who said, "I wish to wake up and the sea has swallowed Gaza," because for them, Gaza is a demographic burden. How genocidal is that, right? And a lot of people also think of the genocidal statements like this is something new. As a matter of fact, Zionist leaders have expressed genocidal intent and have made several genocidal statements since before the creation of Israel, and this is documented because it's linked to the ideology. Zionism, as a settler colonial ideology, is premised on the elimination of the native. It's inherently genocidal. Now, answering your question, yes, the prohibition of genocide under international law is a Yes Kogan's norm, a peremptory norm. So, from which there no derogation is permitted. That's the meaning of the Latin phrase Yes Kogan's. But it's also a prohibition ode erga omnes, and ode erga omnes in Latin or erga omnes parte means that this is a right owed to everyone and a responsibility on every state to ensure that prohibition. And that's why you have the title of this particular convention is not only the punishment for genocide, but also the prevention of genocide. So states have an obligation not only to sit back, watch, and eat popcorn and watch televised carnage until it's concluded, and then they say, well, might be genocide, let's go and prosecute. No, they have a legal responsibility to prevent that from happening when there is serious risks of genocide. Now, I don't need to, I think, elaborate more that the risk is evident. Israel has killed in Gaza in the first month alone more than those killed in the Srebrenica genocide. This gives you an indication. Israel has bombed Gaza in the first week or two more than the US bombed Afghanistan in a whole year. Israel has killed in the first month, killed in Gaza more children than those killed in all conflict areas since 2019. So the numbers are shocking, are crazy. And I think the level of destruction and the deliberate destruction of property, the indiscriminate bombing, in the words of President Biden himself, is unprecedented and unparalleled actually in modern history. We haven't seen this level of destruction since World War II. It's insane that Gaza, the Gaza Strip, a strip of land that is roughly 365 square kilometers, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, have been already bombed in the first month alone with more than two Hiroshima nuclear bombs. In what world do we live in? And states cannot even call for a ceasefire. This is the bare minimum of human decency. Every state or a politician that doesn't do that, the bare minimum of human decency, and call for a ceasefire, is complicit in this genocide. And they have blood of Palestinian children on their hands. You could also imagine states that have the capacity and the influence on Israel to compel it to stop this genocide and not doing so, in particular here, the US. And this is actually the essence of the case with our colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights, because these three individuals, the defendants, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin, are the ones with the power to stop this. A decision from the US would stop this if it's taken now. I don't need to tell you, Tarek, and I actually feel very strongly for Palestinian Americans, because I live in Europe and I also pay taxes here. And in a way, we're in the same boat. It's our own taxes. We would never know, and it's most likely the case that our own taxes being used to kill our own families, and we don't have choice about it. So it's shameful from these governments, especially the U.S., to keep sending American people's tax money to bomb children, to massacring children, and connecting that to what I was just saying, that there is a legal responsibility. We're not asking them for a political favor. They're required by the law to prevent genocide from happening, and they're not only failing in this responsibility and legal obligation, they're actually contributing to that genocide by continue to provide not only arms and financial support to Israel, but also diplomatic coverage. How many times did the U.S. Used veto at the Security Council trying to prevent a call for a ceasefire? So basically, the U.S. is sending one message to the Palestinian people: we will make sure that the genocide continues. I mean, we reached a level where the President of the United States even questioning the numbers of the dead, and the Palestinians had to publish the records of all Palestinians who have been killed. How dehumanizing is that? If there is any shred of dignity left in this administration, we'll build a huge memorial with all the names that they dehumanized in their capital. That's if there is justice or dignity in this world. So that's the situation we're facing. I think this is a historical moment, and the U.S. and the West in general, they are on the wrong side of history, and the South African case, I think, is very important, that it's showing us, while South Africa is learning very well from its history, certain states in the West, like the US, which committed genocide against the indigenous population, and Germany, which is guilty of several genocides, have learned nothing from their own history. On the ICJ, ICC, I think I touched upon that previously, but in brief, the ICJ is a court for interstate litigation. It's the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and states can go to court for disputes between the states. So it's about the responsibility of the state, not necessarily individuals. The ICC is a criminal court. So there also the burden of proof is different, the procedure is different, and it's about specific individuals who are responsible for the commission of crimes, or ordering the commission of crimes, or aiding and abetting the commission of crimes. There are different modes of liability or individual criminal responsibility depending on the position of that person. Sometimes most of the time, it's actually the leaders of that country representing the states, because that's how the orders are made. Sometimes, depending if we're talking about war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide, sometimes it's not only political leaders, it's also military leaders who take the certain decisions about certain strikes. And there is at the ICC, there is an open investigation since 3rd of March, 2021. And we believe at Al Haq, we've made this public several times, that it's long overdue for the ICC prosecutor to start issuing arrest warrants. There is no justification for further delay. And if you allow me I elaborate a little bit about that. There need to be arrest warrants that address the core of the ICC mandate, that is to prosecute those responsible for the most serious crimes, not a war crime here or a war crime there, not quote unquote say settler violence, without talking about settlements themselves, the origin of settler violence. Not to talk only about war crimes, but not to talk about crimes against humanity and the structure of oppression and the regime of racial discrimination imposed on the Palestinian people, the crime against humanity of apartheid. So the crimes that underline the settler colonial nature of the occupation, in my view, are of a particular importance. And I will just mention examples so the public watches and sees when the court moves forward, if the court will take these cases or not. And for me, this is the test: if the court is abiding by the law, delivering on its mandate, or only taking cases depending on what's politically convenient or what will be allowed. Justice should not be like this. Justice should be, as the law says, we follow. We follow the evidence and take cases to court. Not only when certain powers in the world are gracious enough to allow justice and to the certain to which they would allow. So these would be, in relation to crimes against humanity, one of the most important crimes and one of the most settled in law and in fact is the transfer of population into the occupied territories, aka settlements, where there's political consensus, including the US, saying that these are in violation of international law, and they actually constitute a war crime. There is no justification whatsoever not to see cases about settlements. It's the most settled, and it's one of the few crimes that the prosecutor doesn't even need access to the territory to prove. Everything needed to prove this, because this is often used as an excuse. Everything needed for this crime, you can prove from a distance. Satellite imagery will show you the green line and where settlements are being built. And in order to for the nexus between the act and the responsibility of the person, Israel is not even hiding this. They intag this by law and publish it. So everything you need is available in the public domain. In relation to crimes against humanity, most importantly, apartheid and persecution, the whole regime of racial discrimination imposed on the Palestinian people as a whole, but in particular in the occupied Palestinian territories. So I think only time will tell. And I hope the court moves in the right direction and deliver on its mandate without fear or favor.
And Fahad, I want you to give us think of some positive words of encouragement to end on. I did want to highlight something here. When I watched Israel make its argument at the International Court of Justice, when it tried to downplay, for example, Netanyahu's biblical reference to Amalek, or play down the various genocidal statements made. And the way they couched it is by saying that the Ministerial Committee of National Security and the War Cabinet are the bodies that dictate policy. Interestingly speaking, at the head of both is the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and part of the national security team has Yoav Gallant, who also made statements, Bezalel Smotrich, who also made statements, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who also made statements, and the War Cabinet, same thing. So it's the same people that are involved in the policy-making circles of Israel. It just shows how far of a stretch they had to go to downplay the genocidal intent, which you mentioned before, that it's not even required at this phase of the case, because we're not at the merits phase. The court doesn't need to prove specific intent. So let's just hope for the best, and let's hope they come back with the main provisional measure, which is the suspension of hostilities, i.e. ceasefire. Taher, I know you work on the ground a lot. Please let us get out of here with something positive, something forward to look upon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tariq. I mean, I'll tell you this, as Palestinians, we're very jaded in general about any global institution holding Israel accountable, primarily for the reason and then the reason why Israel feels so comfortable engaging in acts of genocide is because the United States is so deeply embedded and invested in this genocide that they feel that an accusation of genocide towards Israel is an accusation of genocide towards the United States. And in fact, I think that's in many ways true. And the legal cases that we have today are a reflection of that. However, I think one of the great things that we've seen out of this ICJ trial or case is that Israel's case is so weak that when you look at what their citations are, when you look at what their sources are, it's like watching a high schooler using Wikipedia for most of his sources in his paper. And so it's really, I think, easy for the judges in this case, if they're not politicized or if they're not influenced in any way, as Ahmed mentioned, to make that judgment. And I think it's setting a precedent now that Israel cannot run away from. Neither can the United States, frankly. And I know for a fact that there are people in the United States, in the U.S. administration, the White House in particular, who are really gravely concerned about charges of genocide. people in the State Department, from what I've been hearing, have refused to sign off on any thing with regards to Israel because they don't want their name attached to the genocide, and so they're sending these requests directly to Blinken to sign himself. And so there's like a real fear in the Department of Defense and in the Department of State in the White House of certain staffers, certain individuals who don't want their name on what's happening, and that's a clear indication that when push comes to shove, and the genocide charges stick, I think Americans will drop the Israeli leaders, and that's why there's a lot of discussion right now in the Biden administration about the day after Netanyahu, because I think they're thinking about throwing him away. That's a political move that they're willing to make to cover for their own complicity in the genocide. The positive thing is, from what we're seeing across the country, we've had cities on a local level, even on the local level, pass resolutions in support of ceasefire. And what's happening is, and I'm engaged in one discussion here in Minneapolis, where I live, the Zionist lobby groups have their backs so far against the wall that they can't really argue against the ceasefire. It's really difficult argument for them to make that they need to continue, that the United States needs to continue supporting this genocide, and they can't openly state that they're not supportive of a ceasefire, but what they'll try to obfuscate the truth and say that they're supporting the elimination of Hamas or armed groups, or et cetera, et cetera. And so what's happening now is the public is seeing this live. They're watching the genocide unfold, the most well-documented genocide in history unfold in front of their own eyes, on their own phones and TV sets, and then they're hearing these Zionists make bogus arguments to continue supporting this, and they're coming to the natural conclusion that Israel is horrific. It's a settler colonial regime that needs to not just stop this genocide in Gaza, but we need to reconsider its entire premise for its existence. If it's the entire premise of Israel's existence is the elimination of the Palestinian people, then we need to question that premise. And so what's happening now, I think a very positive trend, is that from among the younger, especially the younger generations who are clearly disillusioned with Israel and have no love for genocide, are saying, hey, you know what, we need to reevaluate not just the U.S. quote unquote relationship with Israel. We need to reevaluate why we allow this entity to exist in a world where we're trying to build better futures for everyone. And I think that's a very interesting development that's taken place naturally, without anybody prying or anybody trying, really, but simply because Israel has shown its true face to the world as just a genocidal maniacs hell-bent on eliminating the Palestinian people, and as Ahmed mentioned, dealing with this demographic problem that they feel they have, and now they're engaged in the equivalence of their own final solution for Gaza. And I think nothing they can do can cover that up. And it's becoming more abundantly clear. And I think the tide is rising. And when that wave finally hits, Netanyahu, Gallant, the head of the military in Gaza, I forget his name, all these war room generals and leaders will swiftly meet the sharp guillotine of justice, and it will be so bad that Israel will never recover from this. Israel will never recover from this genocide. Gaza might not ever be the same, but Israel certainly will never recover from this genocide. And I think that, for me, is the hope that I hold on to as someone with family in Gaza. The hope that even if all of us are eliminated, at least Israel will never recover.
Taher, Ahmed, Asta, thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful discussion. Thank you for the wonderful work that you do. And let's keep pushing towards justice and liberation for the Palestinian people. Jazakallah khair. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.